Welcome to The Shadow Knows, a podcast where we journey into the depths of the psyche, mystery, and transformation. Hi, I'm Maureen.
Hi, and I'm Klara. Together, we explore the hidden forces shaping our lives, relationships, and collective story. In today's episode, we are exploring one of the most less understood archetypes. It is the king-queen archetype. This archetypal energy governs sovereignty, order, responsibility, and the capacity to bless life rather than dominate it. In a time of collapsing authority, distrust of leadership, and widespread confusion around power, the king and queen archetypes are often distorted, appearing either as tyranny, passivity, or absence altogether. Yet, when integrated, this archetype provides inner order, ethical authority, generativity, and the ability to hold both care and consequence. Joining us once again is James Frazier, Jungian coach, holotropic, and neo-shamanic breathwork facilitator to help us explore the king and queen archetype through a Jungian lens and what it means to embody mature, conscious authority in both personal and collective life. Welcome, James.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
James, from a Jungian perspective, how would you describe the mature, integrated king, queen archetype, and how does this differ from the shadow expressions we commonly see today, such as the tyrant, the weak ruler, or the abdicated sovereign?
Okay. I think in some ways, the king and queen archetype have to do with the issue of power. They also have to do with organization and bringing about right order. They don't just happen automatically. They have to have the support of the other archetypes and their mature expression. But it's not just about mere power. It's also how that power gets used for the good of the kingdom. So in the mature expression of this archetype, what you would see is somebody who has the ability to be in service to something greater than themselves, someone who can become the fructifying force for the kingdom. So they're like the cornucopia that feeds the kingdom. Also includes things like protecting the vulnerable, establishing boundaries, but most importantly, providing a psychological center. One of the things we're really missing. Without a center, you tend to get chaos. Without good boundaries and containment and the sense of limitation and the ability to take on responsibility, what you get is chaos. So these particular archetypes, when they are seen in their shadow form, it's usually a failure of initiation of sorts, which can often start very early. Our earliest experience of these two archetypes come through the parents. If we have difficulties with parenting, for example, if you have a very abusive situation with an abusive father, that's going to imprint and shape your relationship to the king archetype. And so you may yourself turn into a tyrant. The other flip side of that was where there's an absence of this energy in your early experience, so you get a failed initiation into this particular arena. And what happens, you have a collapsed king and queen. So you have a very difficult time finding a center. You'll be looking for the center outside yourself. You'll have a hard time wrapping your mind around the whole idea of being in service to something greater than yourself. On the one hand, on the active side of it, you get the tyrant holdfast who's only interested in power, the narcissistic personality disorder, so to speak. And on the other, you get the abdicating king or queen, person that fathers 3 children and then says, this is too much for me, I'm out of here, and abandons the children, abandons the wife, abandons the kingdom. Or again, you have somebody who just degenerates into a craving for power, and it's power and dominance over, not power to fructify the kingdom.
So, James, many people today have an almost distrust of authority, external and internal. How do you see this reflecting a collective wound around the king and queen archetype? And what happens psychologically when inner authority is either inflated or missing?
Okay, well, we may have always had problems with this, but if you think about it in terms of the history of humanity, you could fairly say, well, who invented this idea of having a king or a queen in the first place? Of course, we don't have much evidence of that until we start settling down. We start transforming into an agricultural society. More and more people begin to collectively live together. You have to come up with order. Otherwise, it's just chaos and the thing doesn't work. The more people tend to congregate, the more you have a need for this particular organizing principle. I think the magician's probably the first one that really came online, but probably fairly shortly after that was the warrior, and of course the lover, in order to keep the whole species going. But then this highest development would be actually a person who serves as the psychological center, the one who brings about order. And we even date civilization by when we started having kings and queens and we started coming up with rules and regulations. That certainly has potential for being abused. When it's working appropriately, it allows us to live. This is an energy that's very prone to our narcissistic striving. This is one of the things we struggle with. We've collapsed the whole idea of eldership. There should be somebody in charge whose focus is on the kingdom, not on themselves. But to have a sensibility that having an authority is okay is rather foreign to many of us. I mean, I grew up in the 60s. As a general rule, or half the population at least the group I was involved with, we eschewed all authority. We didn't want any authority. We wanted total freedom, total lack of rules. And of course, you saw what happened. It turned very chaotic, sort of constellated a backlash of a more fundamentalist view of authority. You realize there's more to life than just getting your own narcissistic needs met, that you have the ability to become aware of the fact of your role in society and culture, in your family. You have the ability to take on a sense of responsibility and not just view it as, oh, this is something I'm being forced to do, but more along the lines of, well, this is something I've been asked to steward. And that, again, could be your own inner life. It could be your family. It could be your community. Maybe you're one of those people who's called to the world stage. In fact, the true king is always sacrificial. If you look at our religious history of Judeo-Christian, particularly the Christian part of it, there is this sacred king business all throughout that story, including the ultimate sacrifice for the good of the kingdom. But we haven't really managed to take that up really well. We've had some time periods where it was bubbling close to the surface. I would argue, for example, that the 12th century, it was coming very close to the surface in the form of the Grail King romances, where all those stories are really about initiation and about coming to kingship. We often have examples of shadow kings and shadow queens, and people who are very interested in dominance and very interested in control, but it's no sense of the sacred, no sense of having a sacred role, and even of being sacrificial.
It seems like I've been noticing there is this collective almost wish and need to have the one savior. Is that projection of the individual need to connect with this inner authority, with this inner archetype, just being spread collectively because of such a need or the lack of connection with our own inner authority?
Well, it's an unfortunate fact that most of these archetypes, for the majority of people, are unconscious, and therefore they're played out in generally projection. So if I reach a life cycle stage, for example, and I'm being called to actually become more mature, being called to grow up more, to take more responsibility, to become more involved in whatever my kingdom is, and whatever level that is, but I don't know anything about that, then I'll tend to start looking outside myself. And so I'll look for a savior messianic character. And the first charismatic person that comes along who's able to hook my own unconscious, I may suddenly turn into a pretty fanatical follower of that person. This is not confined to spiritual circles, but it does happen in spiritual circles quite frequently. It also happens in almost all of our institutions. It happens in politics. It happens in our families. It happens all over the place. It's a denial of the responsibility, but it's also, in fairness, we're growing up in a culture that's sort of mythologically and initiatorily toned deaf. We don't really have a sensibility about this, whereas I think more ancient pre-modern peoples had much more connection to this, at least functionally, even if not consciously. They may not have been able to give you a lecture about it, but they were functioning more that way. So if I'm needing to connect with something, but I don't know that it's inside, I look outside. And that's where it becomes really dangerous, because I start projecting this inner king or inner queen onto someone outside myself. If they don't have the maturity to know that that's what's going on, they're very likely to just take all of my gold and run with it. Whereas the real king and the real queen is always concerned with giving you back your gold. So if you happen to to be very fortunate as I was when I met Robert Moore. I didn't have any connection to my king at all. The person who introduced me to Robert Moore was Ron Herring, and Ron was just very insightful and gifted and knew that that was what was happening and was continually giving me back my gold and encouraging me to own it. And by the time I found Robert's work, it had matured enough that I could see that that's what needed to happen. So it was okay for me to project it onto him as long as I remembered that the real goal was the one that I need to develop my inner king. So our outer mentors can be guides. Well, each one of us is called to develop our connection to that inner king, to develop our inner sovereignty. And of course, if we don't, our life won't function near as well as if we have that sense of autonomy that comes from, and even self-esteem that comes from being connected to the king. It's an incredibly important function of the king and queen is to actually bless a person, because that blessing essentially gives you the message that you're okay and we're delighted you're in our kingdom. It helps instill a foundation of self-esteem, a foundation of autonomy, a sense that you matter, a sense that your life is meaningful, and also that you have somebody on your side who's going to help you achieve that special thing that you're here to do. And if you don't have it, it leads to the curse, so to speak. You either get blessed or you get the curse. And with the curse, you're walking around with often an internalized critic saboteur who's constantly berating you and telling you don't measure up. And so then we spend our whole life trying to measure up instead of operating out of that real deep inner sense of not righteousness, not in that sense of, oh, I'm right, but in the sense of, I'm the person here to bring about right order, and I'm the person here willing to take the responsibility. And so even if everything around me is going chaotic, it's my job to not be chaotic. It's my job to bring about cosmos. So in some sense, this is what's all really one of the main threads behind our religious mythologies, our religious stories, our religious practices. And I would even argue they're supposed to be behind our psychological practices. If you can help people do this, you will see some enormous progress in their life. When someone becomes a full-blown drug addict or alcoholic, their life becomes progressively more and more chaotic, as well as everybody around them. And then if they have the good fortune to get into some kind of program that can help them start becoming drug-free and alcohol-free, one of the things you see is their life gets less and less chaotic. They become more and more capable of creating cosmos. And even in something like Alcoholics Anonymous, they move from being brand new beginner to being the person who's helping other people steward their processes. They become the old timers, and their life gets much better, arguably even healthier than average.
Thank you, James.
Jung warned that power becomes most dangerous when it's unconscious. How does an unintegrated king-queen energy show up in shadow forms, such as control, rigidity, moralism, or spiritual superiority, of which I know nothing about?
I don't either, but I did read a couple of books about that, so I've learned a little bit about it. Well, I like all the archetypes, they really do require, from my point of view, a certain stewardship and regulation. And thus, if they're unconscious, you are likely going to be acting them out or flooding with them or disconnected from them. So in the case of the king, you start believing that you actually are the king instead of you're supposed to be serving the self. And then you get an inflated ego. So the ego becomes king, and that's where you get all this narcissism. And then some people take that to extremes. Most of us don't. It's kind of an axiom. If the archetype is unconscious, or at least if you're not doing conscious things that would help you learn to regulate that. You might never learn the word archetype, but you could still have access to the kind of learning and good imprinting that you would see this as just your duty. I had a scoutmaster when I was young who just carried this king archetype like nobody's business, but he wouldn't have known what the hell that word meant if his life depended on it. But for whatever reason, he had developed into somebody who was extremely giving. I mean, he kind of devoted his life to these young men. One of the few role models I had, actually, as a child. So if we don't do this consciously, we're going to do it unconsciously. And unconsciously is going to be active polarity of that's the tyrant. This is a person who really starts believing their own press that they themselves, their egoic self, is supposed to be the king, and the whole kingdom exists to serve them. Or the other side of it is the abdicated king or queen who says, hey, I don't want any of this responsibility business, I'm out of here. And then you have a collapsed king or queen, and then you have, again, chaos. There's no right order. And so everything tends to be chaotic and dysfunctional. And you don't have the ability to bless other people. Now, if you have several generations of people who don't really get this adequately, they can't adequately pass this on either without doing some pretty serious inner work and coming to understand this, and maybe even some, as the Greeks would say, agnoia experiences, powerful experiences of change of consciousness, where they flip from being narcissistic to being able to be in the true king and the true queen, which is being able to be blessing and devoted to a mission greater than yourself. So again, it's always sacrificial duty. Well, in a culture that's lost the sense of the sacred, which is rather odd in America because we're, in some sense, the most religious culture in the world in terms of numbers of church buildings per corners, I don't know that we could make any kind of claim to be the most sacred, have a sense of the sacred, or we wouldn't be doing as much dysfunctional things as we are. That seems to clearly prove we don't have a sense of the sacred.
James, I want to go back to about the early wounding in the sovereign archetype. I can speak from my own experience now that I've done some of this work, looking at it as me as a little girl. I completely idealized my father. However, I was frightened by him, and that made me think about my own connection to authority and how it shaped that early relationship to a father figure, how it shaped the relationship with my own authority. So how does the early experience with either parents or caregivers or institutions shape the shadow of the king or queen archetype, particularly when authority, let's say, was abusive, absent, or inconsistent?
A couple things that come to my mind. You're supposed to have what Winnicott would call good enough parenting, that the parents, they don't necessarily have to know these concepts, as they are in the role that they're supposed to be the conveyor belt of these archetypes to the child. And so you come here already hardwired to get that. You already are hardwired for them to be the king and the queen. So there's a natural tendency, especially in the opposite sex parents, to idealize them, particularly as you're just beginning to build your ego around age 3.5 or 4. But what happens if your parent is inadequate in their ability to channel that energy? If they're on the positive, active polarity, they'll be the tyrant, and sometimes frighteningly, dangerously, pathologically so. I mean, I've had clients whose father would come home drunk on Friday night and drag out the shotgun and line up the kids and essentially threaten to play Russian roulette which one they were going to take out that night. I mean, I'm giving you the extreme example of this, of course. And you work with those kids and you find out that 2 of them still idealize that father. And you think, what the hell is going on there? I mean, come on. The guy came home drunk and threatened to kill you, and you still idealize him? Well, yes, because there's 2 things going on. One, I'm built in for that idealization. I'm sort of programmed for that. But then I wind up putting it in the hands of somebody who has no business having that kind of authority or that kind of idealization. Because one, they don't know what to do with it. It just becomes really pathological. So then later on in life, I'll either distrust all authority, I won't trust anybody, particularly my own authority, and view all power as bad. All authority is bad. So they'd like to just tear down all authority. The problem is, of course, that just leads to more chaos. That's not the answer. The answer is to try to bring about mature authority that could handle it appropriately. And then you have to learn how to modulate where to put that, how to idealize and how to not over-idealize, and how to accept authority but also develop your own inner authority. In that same situation, you could become somebody who comes home Friday nights and drags out the shotgun and threatens to kill the children. In other words, you turn into what you experienced. So many other ways we could look at this, but the central issue of power is one that I think every psychotherapist, and actually I would even go so far as to say everybody involved in a religious vocation, if you think of that religious vocation as being a steward for personal growth and spiritual development, has to deal with the issue of power. One of the reasons why we have so many problems in these human institutions, I'm not talking about the metaphysical or the dogmas or the other belief systems, but just in the carrying of the weight of that. And there are some people who do it marvelously well. And there are other people who turn the most sacred roles into the most pathological. So your early experience is going to shape how you deal with the issue of power, and then that's going to shape how you deal with the whole issue of king and queen. So I spent a year in England, and it was the most amazing experience for me because the whole time I was there, I was fascinated by the royal family. And of course, there's great controversy around the royal family. Many people would like to get rid of the sovereignty, and other people see it for what it is, and all. Other people complain about the amount of money that's spent on all this extreme wealth. But one of the things that I noticed there is that there's a sense of a center there that we are lacking here, even in the sense of architecture and layout of towns and villages. I mean, you go to any, I don't care if it's the smallest one pub town in England, it has a center. All the way to the great metropolis of London, there's a center to London. And all the transportation goes to the center. And it's not the place of decay. It's the place where the most expensive shops are, often even named the high street. Whereas in America, like I lived in a place in the Midwest, I moved there in 1986, and they had just torn up the downtown area and tried to convert it into a walking mall in order to get people to come downtown because the whole thing was just falling into decay. Every year they would have a study. Civic leaders would get together, form a committee, and do a year-long study on why we don't get people to come downtown. And they tried everything. We don't have that sense of a center anymore, or if we do, it's decayed. And this, I think, is a mythological and psychological metaphor for really what's happening in the modern world. We don't have that sense of center. It's because we've lost our connection to this inner sovereign. I think we're probably going to have to bring about some great new spiritual revival and reclaim the sacred feminine to stand with the sacred masculine. Both of those are in disrepair, not just the sacred feminine, to bring about a new dispensation or melting down the old and recasting it into the sense of a new, come to a new awareness that this inner journey can no longer be left only outside. It can no longer be left to the professionals. It really has to come about as an inner transformation. How do I get into a positive relationship with this archetype? Because this is where true blessing comes from. It's where true self-esteem comes from. It's where right order comes from. And it is where cosmos comes from, out of chaos.
If someone hasn't fully claimed their own inner authority, how do we end up projecting power onto others? Like, I think we expect leaders or institutions to save us, or reacting against them as if they're oppressive.
Well, there is a psychological premise within, especially within Jungian psychology, around projection, and that is that whatever we are not in touch with, or whatever we disown, or whatever we repress, we will meet it coming at us in the form of us projecting it outward onto someone else. So if I'm not comfortable with power, I'll find somebody to idealize, and I'll project my power onto them. Whenever I'm around them, I'll feel weak because, in fact, I've given them my power. So projection is actually not a terrible bad thing because it's really not us projecting. It's the unconscious content projecting itself in an effort for us to become aware of it. Now, what we tend to do, however, we just do the projection. We stop there. So our whole cult of celebrity is built around this. If you don't believe we have a cult of celebrity, just go to your favorite news outlet, whatever it may be. Doesn't matter if it's conservative or progressive or liberal or anything in between. Divide out the news stories that day and see how many of them are about the minutia of some celebrity's life. As so-and-so got a new hairstyle. It's like, really, with all the problems facing the world, do I really need to know that information? Well, in the cult of celebrity, of course I do, because that's important stuff, where we disavow our responsibilities about our own development, push it off on someone else. And say, well, I could never be an artist, of course, because you have to be a Picasso or a Van Gogh. And, well, no, we're all supposed to be artists. We have the great gift of an opposable thumb, and we have a brain that's 10 times as bigger than it needs to be. I think we're all supposed to be creative. So this whole business of projection, idealization, recollection of that projection is also one of the most important parts of our own inner development. I can look at someone and admire them and use them as a role model, but I also need to be asking myself, what do I see in them that I have not fully owned in me? And this is both the good and the bad, but especially the good. If you do personal growth and development with people, most people, after they get comfortable with you, they'll start telling you all that's wrong with them. But then you start trying to get them to own their gifts, and they start backing up and heading out the door. It's like, oh no, I could never do that. Why not? If I was a basketball fan, particularly since I used to live in the Chicago area, Michael Jordan is obviously the most famous, if not arguably perhaps one of the best basketball players ever to live. And if I leave everything at the level of my admiration for him and idealization of him, and somebody says to me, well, why don't you play basketball? Oh, I can never play basketball. I can never be like that. Well, perhaps I'm not going to be a Michael Jordan, but I could put up a basketball hoop and go out there and shoot baskets, especially with my son and grandson. Get a little physical exercise in, but I don't because I'm so ashamed that I'll miss 9.7 goals out of 10 tries. The point is to engage in the activity. While again, I could use Michael Jordan as a role model, I could also fall into that thing where I won't even put up a basketball because I already know I can never be like that. So this idealization thing can really be very, very difficult for us to handle. We both need idealization, but we also can fall into the trap of idealization.
And so, James, what happens if we don't have someone to idealize? Then what happens to the inner authority?
Well, in the case of the king and the queen, usually we'll more likely go into the shadow side of this. We'll either be rageful about that fact that I don't have anybody to idealize, and so we may act it out in a very tyrannical kind of way, very unconscious, but nevertheless very active polarity of that, or it'll collapse and then I just become ineffective at life. There are lots of people who are more terrified of taking on the responsibility for their own life. So you ask them, what do you want to do? And their answer is, I don't know. And they're not joking. They don't know. See, the sovereign of the royal sector is where purpose comes from. It's where knowing what you want to do and going and getting it. It's where seeking out, well, what is my task to steward? Who should I be stewarding here? And if your answer is, well, I don't have anybody to steward, then you're not trying. Because there are a lot of people that need help. And even if it's just an encouraging word to somebody you perceive as struggling, that's a kind of stewardship. It's an attempt at blessing. But so many of us didn't really get blessing. We got the curse. And so we don't feel equipped to do that. But a good way to start this, you want to get in touch with this king and queen. Here's an exercise. Get in your car and drive to a bad part of your town and ask yourself, what is the state of my kingdom? And then secondly, is there anything that I can do without anybody's permission to make some effort to change this? Well, for a lot of people, it's just complaining about the bad part of town, to drive around and then imagine that you have your king and queen crown on and go, well, if it's my responsibility, how can I be more in kingship? You don't have to start with that. You can start right in your own household. You can say to yourself, well, I've got a young child in my household. Am I being the good, blessing queen? That, by the way, does not mean I'm being the permissive, let them do whatever they want to do. That's not it at all, because the king and queen are very capable of boundaries. They're very capable of demanding efficacy. Every time my child who's struggling to learn how to tie their shoes, if I jump in and I get frustrated with them and I push them out of the way and I tie the shoe for them, that's not being a good king and queen. That's just teaching them that they can wait till somebody else does it for them. So you need to have efficacy demands, but you also need to have that capacity for blessing. That would include things like meaningful, non-sexual touch. A friend that I met many, many years ago, he happened to be from Puerto Rico, and he was one of the most interesting people to be around energetically. But he was always touching you, but it was meaningful, blessing touch, not sexual. And you just felt better when you were around him. And many of us didn't get that, and we need it. Some of us we got very little of that. We're kind of stingy with our blessings. It doesn't cost anything to bless anybody. I think I grew up in a generation where people were sort of taught not to bless your children because they grew up selfish. Then that meant the absence of blessing. So you didn't really get that grounded baseline of self-esteem that comes out of the royal sector. You need to have a sense that the person blessing you has the capability of blessing you and that they are interested in blessing you. that they have some attachment to you developing your life, and they have some vision for you, and in fact they'll commit to helping you attain that vision. They're not supposed to tell you the vision, because that's often just them playing out their unmet needs.
What are the core psychological functions of healthy king and queen energy? How does this archetype create inner order, ethical containment, and the capacity to bless, as you were mentioning, rather than just dominate life?
Well, of course, in some ways, the first step is even becoming aware that there is such a thing, and then becoming aware that this is my responsibility to get connected to this inside. Now, typically, the way this has happened is only through projection. And largely, I think probably the container and carriers of this have been our religious structures, where this sense of inner stewardship has lost ground to an ever-increasing development of ego. Before anybody misinterprets me, I'm a big fan of developing of ego. We have lots of fractured egos and weak egos and egos that are not capable of withstanding the pressures from inside or outside. So I don't mean to be bad-mouthing the ego, but our sense of individuality and sort of conversant narcissism, because we're not getting this stuff stewarded correctly, has really created huge problems. Partly I would point to something as simple as us moving off of farm type of situations to moving to cities. If you live on a farm, you're going to have to be pretty dependent on the people that live around you. You won't make it. And most of us lived in family systems. Now, they might have been dysfunctional, but there was still, you could go across the road to stay with Aunt Jill and Uncle Bob when things got tough at home. There was an interconnectedness and interdependency. When you move to a city, you can become completely anonymous. I mean, I'm ashamed to say this, but where I lived in Illinois, my last house, I lived there for 10 years, and I never spoke to the person who lived across the street from me. I would wave to him when we were both out mowing the lawn, but I never got off my lawnmower and walked across the street and introduced myself. Whereas, you lived on a farm, you knew everybody lived around you for 10 miles, and you were interdependent with them. I think there's something about our lifestyle that's contributing to all this. I think it's something about our progress mythology that has fed into this. We just now, as a culture and as a general rule, think that people are going to grow up and become adult and take responsibility when they turn 18 without any intervention by the culture. And that's the big piece that's missing. That's what was always the function of kingship and eldership, was to oversee the culture. Even though we call these folks primitive in scare quotes, they often are much more sophisticated than we were about a sensibility that, like that old saying, it takes a village to raise a child, where we're becoming kind of a garage door culture, where people back out of their garage and go to work in an office building and come home and pull into their garage and again may wave at their neighbor when they're mowing the lawn, but that's about it. Again, first you have to become conscious of it, then you have to become aware that it's your responsibility to do the developmental processes, and then it enormously helps if you have ritual process, which we don't have ritual processes that really help us do this, or at least it's harder to see it in the modern world. I think we have a lot of unconscious ritual processes around this. Again, I talked about the cult of celebrity. That's one of the ways we're unconsciously working this out. Become aware, oh yeah, this is part of my responsibility, is to serve self. This is really what Jung calls the process of individuation. It's where the ego wakes up to the fact that it is supposed to be in service to something much greater than it. It's not the center. It's the center of consciousness, but it's not the center of the self. If you have a religious practice that actually works and pays a lot of attention to the symbolic, the mythological, the ritual processes, then it's possible that you're doing this. But increasingly, that's not what's happening. In many cases, our religions are turning into persona religions. A lot of our religions seem to be much more interested in the issue of power through politics than the development of what I'm referring to as power to bless, power to steward, power to be that king and queen, power to be that center for others, and to fructify a kingdom, as opposed to, just something as simple as paying attention to the vulnerable. I don't want to get into politics here, but it would be very easy to do so. You ask yourself about any culture, how do they, and my measurement for any culture is how do they protect the weak and the vulnerable? What systems are in place to address the needs of those folks? Or is it mostly set up to address the needs of the most powerful? If it is, then you're in the Shadow King, Shadow Queen territory as far as I'm concerned. And this is where a mentor can really help you because they're not in your emotional material so much. They can make sure that you get some of this blessing and learn about it. Even if it's something very simple as going out of your way to acknowledge someone's efforts. If you go to a restaurant and it's super busy and your food is late, you have a choice. You can be really upset and irritated and take it out on the waitress and make sure you don't leave her but a $2 tip. Or you can go the other way and go, wow, she's probably really having a hard day today. And maybe acknowledging that, congratulations. I don't know. I couldn't do what you're doing. I couldn't keep all these people straight. That's really small on the big level, but you don't know how effect that might have on that person. So again, I think it's a self-reflection. It's learning blessing rituals. It's trying to look at the issue of power. Am I shying away from power? What is my actual relationship to the concept of power? Do I automatically want to tear it down? Am I automatically always suspicious of it? Or do I try to seek out people who are using it responsibly and try to emulate so that I'm using my power responsibly?
Just a quick comment, and then we'll move on to the next question. I believe that the cavalry is not coming, and we really cannot rely on the governments of the world to take care of the vulnerable. I think it's our own individual responsibilities, and that was the responsibility of the church years ago, and still is in some communities.
Well, again, I don't want to sound like I'm knocking religions, but you're absolutely right. I think also this whole business of stewardship in terms of trying to help people mature was a bigger part in previous times. And I'm certainly not knocking religions. This was a big split between Freud and Jung, where Freud was absolutely anti-religion, thought religion was basically psychopathology. And Jung said, no, you can't call something that's been practiced all over the world pathological. Now, it has pathological expressions, as every human endeavor does. But I think what we really are being called for here is to reevaluate our responsibility to these deeper things inside and not just leave it through projection. We're too close to the edge for that. We really need people who are willing to say, okay, well, this whole business about stewardship, what can I do? And that's also the inner, in terms of how can I steward my inner connection to this archetype of the sovereign.
Thank you. I like that. Okay, so this particular question has a lot to do with responsibility. And I'm going to use the Godfather, Michael Corleone, sort of to ask this question. So Michael Corleone, he resists responsibility. He wants a life. He explicitly resists responsibility as far as I can see. It's like, that's my family, not me. He wants a life without power or moral weight. And I think when responsibility is taken unconsciously, using this as an example, power becomes controlling and paranoid, and then leadership can turn tyrannical. And unlike the other archetypes, the king-queen doesn't get to ghost responsibility. How does that resistance turn shadowy? And how do we tell if we're carrying responsibility like a curse or holding it as stewardship that we've actually consented to?
Well, you've picked a particularly complex character to use as the example of this, because we don't typically think of, in this case, the mafia don, who's quite capable of being a cold-blooded killer, as sovereign. I actually watch a lot of film about these types of characters because, for one thing, they're much more interesting. And in the case of Corleone, you can see that initial, I don't want any part of this criminal family. I just want to go, I'll serve my country and then I'll just do normal stuff. But at some point, he realizes, and in some sense, I think it's because of a threatening attempt on his father's life, that it begins to really wake up to this whole sovereign energy. And many times you see this in these actual very shadowy characters. They have a connection to this, but it is limited to their family. So on the one hand, they don't have any sense of this in terms of everybody else, but to their family, they're just majorly in the positive king. You see this in the recent Peaky Blinders series that was done about a gang in Birmingham, and the gang leader is, for all practical purposes, Tommy Shelby, who again is a cold-blooded killer. I mean, he'd blow your head off and not even think about it. He survived the war in France, where presumably he had to kill hundreds of people. He's not somebody you would look to as a prime example of integration of the king, and yet when it comes to his family, he's absolutely in that sovereign energy. He protects everybody. He thinks about all of them. He's very sacrificial in that way toward his family. So it's a very interesting split. Of course, literature is quite capable of doing that, as is the psyche. We might be very good in our sovereign energy in one arena of our life and not particularly good at others. Again, I think if we take it off of just that particular character and say, well, how do you wake up to this? And then what are the things that would cause somebody to wake up to the fact that they have this duty and this responsibility? And that's probably as unique as in each individual character. In my own life, it happened through me meeting a mentor who carried this positive king energy. And so it was only by meeting someone who was really openly carrying that I began to become aware of the deficit I had around that. And so that sort of agnoia kind of experience, and then again, the great blessing that happened to me of meeting Robert Moore, was a gigantic thing for me. And learning and deepening into Jungian psychology and learning more and more about initiation. And this is still ongoing, by the way. I don't want to present myself as somebody who hasn't had a huge struggle with a lot of this material, because I have. I've made some progress, and I'm glad to report on that. It's very possible that people split this kind of material, where you can be doing pretty well with this connection, except in other arenas of your life, you're not doing well at all. Does that kind of answer the question?
Well, yes, I suppose I could have used a different example, like maybe the Lion King.
Well, I'm going to get this plug in because I don't get much of an opportunity to do this, but I would encourage everyone to think about the Grail myth, first of all. They're a very, very powerful set of stories. If you don't want to go the trouble of doing all that literature and investigation, is to watch the movie called The Fisher King. And it's a movie with Jeff Bridges and Robin Williams and Mercedes Ruehl. And it starts off with this disc jockey who's very famous, actually patterned after Howard Stern, but he's an inflated shadow king. He really thinks he is the top, and he's arrogant, he is disrespectful, and just has no concern for the kingdom. It's only the kingdom exists to feed him. And then he screws up, and one of the people that call into his show winds up committing a murder, and it crashes his entire career. So he goes at the top of the network broadcasting tower, and he's thrown into the street. Ultimately, it's a great story about how one person comes to, without ever getting any lecture about all this, but through their life experience, he comes to having to face the issues around his own development, or lack of. But that would be also another way of beginning to think about this material, to watch that film and go, well, who's carrying the Shadow King? And who's the Shadow King? Does he transform into the positive king? And I would argue he does. I would argue there's a lot of transformation of all the characters in that film, but especially the one of Jeff Bridges, and then even arguably Robin Williams. I think Robin Williams was a brilliant actor, and it was the greatest role he ever did. And it's an absolute brilliant screenwriting.
James, you speaking about the Fisher King movie kind of brings me to my other question about the vulnerability of the sovereign. Jeff Bridges' character, obviously, when he was in his Shadow King, thought of himself as invulnerable. Yet Jung emphasized that the authority requires humility and relationship to the self. So would you agree that this archetype is vulnerable? And what happens when we deny this vulnerability?
Well, if you deny the vulnerability, it just goes underground, and that means you're more vulnerable and you're more frightened. And so what you go into is more tyrannical control, which makes you want to be a dictator, so that you are the central arbitrator of all reality. It's a Jungian axiom that things don't disappear. They're either held in consciousness and struggle with, or they recede or repressed into unconsciousness, where they will wreak havoc. So often it's hard to see it, but the person who is the dictator is the most fearful person of all, because they are vulnerable. That's the whole business about having an inner circle, for example. If you look at a dictator like Stalin, who the worst place to be in Stalin's kingdom, in some sense, of course, was to be at the lowest end of it, because you were more susceptible to being hauled off to a gulag. The apparently best place would be to be in his inner circle, but that wasn't correct, because if you were in the inner circle, that meant you were powerful enough to overthrow him. And his greatest fear was being overthrown. So every once in a while, every third Friday night or something, one of them was just taken out and shot. Keeps everybody else on their toes. So you get into that kind of active side of it where the king is vulnerable. And this is also played out, of course, in every one of us, our existence. We are born the king or the queen. We are the divine child. And if you look at how people react to babies, you can just see it. The baby actually may be ugly as hell, but everybody thinks it's the most beautiful baby in the world. And it's just glowing. The babies glow, and everybody's attention is other. They're the central king, queen. But they're also the most helpless thing in the known universe. They can't do anything. Well, they can scream and they can poop. Okay, well, there's two things, but other than that, they can't do anything. So built into the dynamic of the human race is this very powerful, still archetypal imprint that I'm the king, but extremely vulnerable. And then, of course, that gets played out, especially in our religious story of the birth of Jesus. This is also connected to the archetype of magician, by the way, but he's immediately vulnerable. Although actually, if you carefully read the story, he becomes very vulnerable at about 2 years of age, which is when Herod sends out the commandment to kill all the Jewish babies under the age of 2. Apparently, it takes the wise man a couple of years to travel from Mesopotamia to the Holy Land and discover the Jesus still in the manger, oddly. But nevertheless, you don't want to read these stories too literally. But he's threatened at birth and has to, in fact, escape to Egypt. So there's this vulnerability, and this, of course, also throughout human existence. Perhaps most vulnerable time is at birth and at old age, because the high rates of infant mortality in the ancient world. So there's something kind of built into the archetype about this vulnerability. How you deal with it, of course, is at one extreme you become the tyrant, at the other extreme you become the person who's just riddled with anxiety because you have no authority and you don't trust any outer authority. So your life is just very hampered and very limited because you have far too much anxiety. You don't have a sense of agency. You don't have a sense of inner authority. So you're always looking outside of yourself. The person who's extremely indecisive, for example, they just can't make a decision because they're always afraid it's going to be the wrong one. They don't have a connection to this inner authority. The person who's riddled with so much shame that they become completely ineffective at life. They don't have a sense of any connection to this royal.
Well, maybe what, James, you can do is a little shameless plug for breathwork and how it relates to the sovereign.
Okay, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of this very quickly. Breathwork is a ritual process that has the potential for connecting you to both your personal unconscious as well as to the collective unconscious. So just that alone makes it an experiential method for you to touch on some of these deeper things to help you become conscious of the fact that they exist. And then also it helps you clear out a lot of your shadow, a lot of the trash that needs to be cleared out in order to even receive that idea that you could be somebody who is deserving of blessing. So you could go from extremely low self-esteem to realizing, well, wait a minute, some of this is just I haven't done the developmental processes that need to be done. And now I'm speaking about our form of breath work, which is a combination of the experiential processes developed by Stanislav Grof in holotropic breathwork and Jungian and neo-Jungian psychology married together.
Wow. Well, thank you, James, for guiding us through this essential exploration of the king-queen archetype and reminding us that true authority is not control or image, but inner alignment. So for each of us, the invitation to reclaim our inner sovereignty, to govern our inner kingdom with clarity and care, and to allow authority to emerge from relationship with the self rather than through fear. Again, I'm Maureen.
And I'm Klara, and I want to thank you for listening to The Shadow Knows. And if today's episode resonated with you, we invite you to subscribe, give us a like, and share with friends. And join us again as we continue exploring the hidden layers of the psyche. Until next time, may you walk gently with your shadow, and may its wisdom guide you home. And remember, the shadow knows.
The shadow knows.
Thank you, James.
Thank you, James.
You're welcome.